my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Andrew Nathan. He is the class of 1919 Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. He must be the foremost expert in Chinese human rights, and his work and service in the cause are truly impressive. You'll get a full account of his accomplishments this evening when Professor Nathan will deliver the annual Lucille Spear Lecture in the University Theater at 8 o'clock. His topic will be, does the rise of China threaten American interests? His topic this afternoon is China's human rights record and why it matters to us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nathan.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm always happy to see Paul Gordon Loren. I teach an Intro to Human Rights course for undergraduates in the fall term. I assign Paul's book. I assign large hunks of it. I make the students buy the book, and every time I see Paul, I tell him he owes me money. He hasn't paid me yet. So my topic today, as I understand it, I should talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have 40 minutes, is my math correct, of discussion. And please chop me if I go over on either piece of it. So the topic that I'm going to present for discussion is China's human rights record, first of all, and then why it matters to us. So there are the two parts. Now, China's human rights, so as Paul will tell you, when you speak about human rights, it's a multidimensional concept. There are a range of human rights norms in the international system, and we often talk about two broad categories of rights, civil and political rights, which would include bodily integrity, the right to various political rights like the right to free speech, the right to association, assembly, and things like that, free trial, various due process rights. Those would be one set of rights, sometimes called negative, but I think that's kind of misleading because they do require often investment. For example, due process requires a court system. It takes a lot of infrastructure. And on the other hand, economic, social, and cultural rights, which include rights to work, to leisure, to education, and things like that. Religious freedom belongs in both categories, probably. So there are many, many different rights. And you can't speak of a complex society like China and say that it's either all bad or all good. I think you can speak about certain societies like North Korea, for example, and say that it's all bad, that all of the rights have been denied and that they're all being violated. And I suppose there are some societies where you can say that there's a heavy, no society is 100% good either, but some of them are quite heavily on the good side. But the case of China is very, very mixed, really. And since China has been growing economically at a rapid pace, since the end of the 1970s, that fact alone, without looking at anything else, spells the improvement in a lot of human rights in China. It means that hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty or up above the official poverty line in China so that their right to a decent standard of living has been provided where it was absent before. And a lot of other things in China have improved as the old totalitarian model has been abandoned and they've gone into a kind of soft authoritarian or liberal authoritarian system. People have a tremendous amount more individual freedom and individual privacy than they used to have 30 or 40 years ago. So we have to celebrate the improvements of human rights in China in these various areas. But there are also remaining a lot of serious human rights violations in China. And I've been involved in Human Rights in China, which is a human rights organization, and a number of other human rights efforts because I'm concerned about these human rights violations. And I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about where the important violations lie. I'm not going to try to give you a complete list, but to try to pick out, I guess I have 5 or 6 kind of major areas of violation, and in each case to talk about how and why those particular violations are generated by the type of political system that China has. In other words, I don't think that violations of human rights are built into the DNA of the Chinese or that they are cultural in some sense. This certainly we can talk about during the discussion part of the seminar. But it seems to me that they're an outgrowth of the political model that China has. And of course, any country's political model is a kind of moving target. It's inherited from the past, and then as you go on day by day, you make adjustments to it. So we can't quite say that the leaders have gotten up, this morning and chosen this political model. They're moving it in various directions. But it is the political model that they have now, which basically works for China now. It's producing political order, economic growth, international influence. And so this political model is fairly entrenched. But it does involve certain violations of human rights. So the first big category of violations of human rights that I want to describe to you is the repression of dissent. And not only open dissent, but even of behavior that the security people think is verging on dissent. You might call it proto-dissent. The red line between what's permitted and what isn't permitted is not a red line. It's not clear at all. It's very vague. My friend Perry Link, with whom I co-edited the Tiananmen papers, has a famous article he wrote in the New York Review of Books, I think it was, called The Anaconda in the Chandelier. I had to look up anaconda, some kind of a snake, but his idea is that the security guys, the censors, are up there. Everybody who writes, talks, and engages in political action and civil society. There's a lot of civil society activity in China, people on the internet, people doing volunteer environmental work, people doing public health work, HIV/AIDS work, women's rights work, things like that. All of these people who are active and who are trying to promote good things that we classify as human rights know that the anaconda is up there in the chandelier and that it can jump out at you and do whatever they do. I'm not sure if they bite you or squeeze you to death. So it's a moving target, and it's enforced by basically the security apparatus. So there are so many cases of this that we've seen in the newspapers. I don't know if you are familiar with any of these names, but some of them are particularly upsetting. So one of the examples is this blind activist in Shandong named Chen Guangcheng, who became blind in his early childhood. He became interested in the issue of women whose reproductive rights were being violated by the local authorities who were enforcing the population planning program, the one-child program. So he began to help these local women to write letters of appeal and to conduct lawsuits. And the local party secretary was angry at his interfering with the population planning program, so the party secretary first arranged for the cops to talk to this guy and say lay off, then they arranged for him to be harassed, then they arranged for him to be beaten up, and when he didn't get the idea, they finally arrested him and tried him for some crazy thing about interfering with traffic and sentenced him to prison. And prison conditions in China are very bad. We can't brag about prison conditions in the United States. They're usually bad in most countries because prisons are underfunded and so forth, and because nobody really checks on how prisons are run. So it's not surprising that in China, prison conditions are very bad and political prisoners are treated badly, and this guy's health has deteriorated. That's one example, but there are many examples of people who are doing, innocent or good things, and who are treated in this way. So another one is Liu Xiaobo, the guy who was the chief organizer of something called Charter 08, you may have read about, that called for the regime to respect the Constitution, its own Constitution, which on paper is pretty good about rights. It talks about freedom of speech and so forth. And the regime decided that he was trouble, so they hassled him for quite a while. And when he didn't get the message, they also tried him and put him in jail, and his health is deteriorating. Now, the underlying mechanism for these, so there are many scores, dozens of examples, famous examples, and lots of unknown examples of this kind of repression of dissent. And dissent, of course, is one of the human rights. It's the freedom of speech and freedom of association. It's one of the fundamental ones. Some people would say the most. I don't like to rank human rights, right, Paul? We don't want to do that. But if you're into that game, some would say freedom of speech is the number one human right. So how does that fit into the regime type, that violation? And the answer is, I think, that this is a regime that's an authoritarian regime that feels insecure. It feels insecure even though it's quite popular, because its popularity is based on its economic performance. And the economic performance in a country like China has been amazing, and I admire it, but it's kind of vulnerable to international markets. Their population is so huge that keeping all those people moving ahead economically is very difficult. So the regime's legitimacy depends on performance, and performance is not something that all of us can do 100% of the time. And they feel, there's not much idea that this is the best possible regime that we would support, even if it didn't perform. And so the regime feels quite vulnerable, also because it has problems of, even though the economy is moving forward, there are many sectors of society that they're having a hard time. There's pollution problems, there's land seizure, but it's a very turbulent, rapidly changing society. So the leaders have decided to empower the security guys. They have a big security apparatus, Ministry of Public Security, Ministry of State Security, Internet Police, Political Police, and others. And they've kind of said to these guys, you're the experts on security, you handle it. And there isn't anybody to check this. Now, if anybody who's a security professional, we could empathize with them. If I were a security professional, my number one job is prevention. And I do a good job as a college professor. If I were a security professor, I would do a good job. I would arrest everybody right up. Prevention, risk aversion is the name of the game in security work. And that's true in New York. It's true in the FBI. But in our system, we have many entities that are checking, right? The media, the courts, the citizens and so forth. And in China, it doesn't work that way. The security guys are very empowered and heavily staffed and funded. And so they're kind of on a runaway task, endowed by the regime, endorsed by the regime to do repression. That's what we do. And so that's, I think, the source of that part of the human rights violations. A second big area of violation is religious repression. The Chinese system, which comes out of a long tradition, Marxism and Russian communism, Stalin's theories about religion and so forth. Their theory basically is, that religion is a kind of superstition that will go away when society is fully modernized. But that since society is not fully modernized, some religion people's religious beliefs have to be permitted. So the state has set up 5 officially permitted religions or religious hierarchies: Catholic, Protestant, Islamic, Buddhist, and I believe, what is the 5th one? Taoist, I think. And they link these into the Communist Party's United Front Work Department, and under that, the Religious Affairs Bureau. And then they closely monitor, to take the example of the Christian denominations, they will determine who's going to be ordinated as a priest or a minister, who will be promoted to be a bishop, what buildings can be built, the budgets of the churches, the sermons that go in the churches, the teaching that goes into the churches, and they outlaw proselytism. So these are the officially endorsed churches. Now, it happens to be that there's a vast movement of unofficial churches, that unknown tens of millions, we don't know because it's all underground, of Chinese choose not to participate in these state-authorized religions and choose instead to participate in various fundamentalist, if I can use that word, Protestant sects, if I can use that word. The language of any kind of language touching on religion, obviously it's very delicate, but I'm trying to cover a lot of ground, so I'll just use those perhaps impolite words. There's a vast underground religious movement, especially among Catholics and Protestants, and then also with various indigenous religions or religious-like movements, of which Falun Gong is an example. This is a kind of martial arts body training which has metaphysical beliefs attached to it and so forth. There are all sorts of religious things happening in Chinese society. The regime views those things as a threat because it wants to make sure that there's no runaway social organization that the party doesn't control. And there certainly is a history in China of various movements with a religious flavor to them. For example, the Taiping movement in the 19th century, making a vast conflagration across the landscape and threatening the survival of the government. So the regime represses these autonomous religious activities, and this leads to many human rights violations. A third area of human rights violations has to do with the treatment of the ethnic minorities. Of the ones that we know the very best are the Tibetans and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They are not the only ones, but those are the most important cases. I'll just talk about those today. And the China that we know on the map is a product of millennia of history, when the political system was smaller and then it was bigger and smaller and bigger, and it covered different populations that were spread across the landscape of Asia. And when the boundaries that we see today sort of got set the way that they are today, the political system of China was covering not only a Han Chinese, or what we think of as Chinese, population that's concentrated over on the, let me see if we're looking at a map, over on the East Coast area and central China. That would be the Han heartland, but a huge, like at least half of the territory of this thing on the map is the area where other populations that are not Han are living, although there are a lot of Han who have moved into these populations. And two of the biggest ones are Tibet and Xinjiang. And in Xinjiang there are several different groups, but the largest one is the Uyghurs. And those people don't think of themselves really as Chinese. Officially they are citizens of the People's Republic of China. If they have a passport, it's a Chinese passport. And of course, they have different ideas. Some of them are very happy to be citizens of the People's Republic of China, but a large part of those populations are people who really don't want to be part of the People's Republic of China. They feel that we used to be independent, or we should be independent, or the Han are oppressing us, and then religion comes into that as well. It's because they have a different religion. The Tibetans have a Tibetan Buddhist religion, and the Uyghurs have an Islamic religion. They're Sunni Muslims. And then there's an ethnic identity that goes with that, a history of oppression, a history of pride in their own. And the policy of Beijing has been to insist on this larger Chinese identity and then to do several things: establish military control and to repress opposition, to move in a lot of Han people, to change the demographic balance, and also to modernize those areas by putting in money and investment in the belief that as you modernize these areas, people will be happy with the improvement of their material conditions and they will become loyal. And that, I think, in a very long run is a winning strategy in this, especially the first finger, that you can control these areas militarily. But I don't think it's a winning strategy in terms of identity dissolution. I think that we have learned perhaps in our history that these identities are important to people, that they're very hard to get rid of, and that if they are to be gotten rid of, it's through cultural pluralism. And this is not the thinking of the regime, because the regime is threatened by these what they view as separatist movements in these societies. So repression is the upper hand there, and there's a lot of arresting of people and repressing of people's freedoms of speech and political activity. The next one I wanted to mention is the difference between peasants and urban residents in China, which is grounded in an actual passbook system, basically. That peasants and urban residents carry a different identification that says you're a peasant or you're an urban resident. This system is being considered for reform. There are reform experiments going on, but it still exists. And the peasants enjoy reduced, inferior rights and benefits to those of the urban population. They can go to the cities to work, but with some exceptions are not allowed to settle in the cities permanently and enjoy the benefits of city life. Now, this system also has a long history of Mao Zedong's development model in China, but it produces a lot of disadvantage for actually the majority of the Chinese peasants who carry these peasant household registration status. And then the last one I want to mention, because I'm using up the part 2 of my time on part 1, as always happens with us professors, is that the Chinese system works very, very well by something that's been labeled as de facto federalism, the decentralization of a lot of power to local party secretaries. So the central government says we have this huge country, 1.3, 1.4 billion people. We want to modernize it. We want to control all these problems that I've been talking about. And their model for doing so is to tell the party secretary in the province and below the province, tell the party. I'm talking about by party secretary, I'm referring to the Chinese Communist Party, which is the ruling party in China. In each unit of administration, it has a party committee, which is the leading people in that place, and that committee has a secretary, and that guy is the #1 guy in any county, town, city, province, ministry, university, any place. The party secretary is the #1 guy. And the way the system works is you tell this #1 guy, let's take a city. If it's a city party secretary, the order is, I'm sending you to this city, you're the party secretary, make it work. I want to see the economy grow. I don't want to see any riots. I don't want petitioners coming from your city to Beijing and complaining about stuff. I don't want the population growth beyond the population growth target. I want performance, and I'm coming back in a year and see how you did. Goodbye. The party secretary then looks at all of his resources. He has the police, he has the courts, he has the media, he has the legislature. He controls all of those things, and then he has his enemies, whoever they might be in that place, whether it's the religious movement, the dissident, or whatever. You make it work. If you make it work, you'll be promoted. That system has produced tremendous results for China, but it also produces many, many human rights violations. Anybody who makes trouble, anybody whose land has been seized, anybody who's got some illness, anybody who's, my wife of a miner who died in a coal mine accident, that's making trouble for the party secretary. Maybe he's a nice guy and he pays you something. Maybe he doesn't want to listen to you. Maybe he thinks you're too persistent. He can do whatever he needs to do to make it work. So that produces a lot of violations. So my conclusion to part one is to say that the Chinese system does produce systemically produces a lot of human rights violations by being constructed in the way that that system is produced. These are not just accidental violations, and I think they're institutionally generated. And that I don't think the institutions are changing in a way and in a direction that's going to stop this very quickly. The second question is why it matters to us. Now, who do I mean by us? I guess I'm thinking there, us could be all of humanity, but I'm specifically thinking about American citizens and policymakers here. I think it does matter to humanity, but I think it might be, and some of the answers overlap. But okay, so how many answers do I have? Look at my notes. 4. I have 4 answers to this question. And the first one I think is pretty quick, is that it matters to us on moral grounds. That's where the philosophy professor comes in, and Kant. I was saying to him that I also teach a course at Columbia. It's an undergraduate required course, CC we call it, Contemporary Civilization, History of Western Social and Political Thought. And we do read Kant, Prolegomena to a Metaphysics of Morals, and the students don't get it, but but they would understand this. It does matter to us because these poor people who are the victims of these violations are suffering. And I think we are moved, and I think that we care, and I think that when we hear some of the stories, we feel outraged, and we want to exercise the privilege that we have of our freedom to protest against those things and call them what they are. I think that's an easy argument to make. This next argument to make probably is much more complicated, but I'll try to make it. I'm also going to talk about this to some extent in the evening lecture, but it actually has been the national policy of the United States. I'm going to tell you something that's true, but many people don't believe, I think. It has been the national policy of the United States since the presidency of Richard Nixon that it is in the security interest of the United States for China to be stable and prosperous. Now, when we talk about the threat of a rising China, that seems like a crazy idea. Why do we want China to be stable and prosperous? Maybe we want China to be weak and unstable so that we can be the most powerful country in the world. But Nixon set off on this policy with engagement in 1972 when he visited Shanghai. He had written actually an article in 1967 in Foreign Affairs magazine basically saying, the world with China over there remote and isolated and antagonistic, was a very big country. It's not a stable world. We really need to draw China in and let the Chinese partake in the prosperity and become part of the world. That will be more stable for the United States in the long run than a China which is trying to spread communism and overthrow the world system. And I think Nixon was wise. I don't like to say anything nice about Nixon, but I think that was a very good strategic insight. And subsequent presidents, all with all the ups and downs and the Tiananmen and the human rights issues, have basically followed that strategy. And I think that the rise of China and its prosperity has been a success of American policy. Not to claim that it's totally our doing. The Chinese obviously had a lot to do with it, but had we set ourselves to frustrate China's policy of entering globalization and producing for export and all that thing, we could probably have frustrated it, and we didn't. We actually participated in it. And the strategy behind that was that China would enter the world, would become wealthy and prosperous, and would be a status quo power and would share an interest in us in the world system. And I think that's been a great strategy. However, I think that these human rights violations that I'm talking about and the structure of the Chinese system that I'm describing constitutes an Achilles heel for the Chinese system that could generate some kind of breakdown, some kind of revolution, some kind of collapse of the system that would actually hurt us quite a lot. What I mean by that is to go back to my point that China's stability depends on performance legitimacy. But as soon as the regime has been, they've hired a lot of econ experts, finance experts, and PhDs, and this, that, and the other thing, many of them trained in the United States, who've been managing their economy very, very well so that they haven't hit, you know, a deep pothole yet. Even with the financial crisis that took place in '08, they managed that very well. But no government goes on forever without hitting a pothole. I mean, you look at our experience as an example of that. And when they hit that pothole, I think because they rely so much on repression of dissent instead of the opening up to settle issues openly, that there is a tremendous political risk in that system. And if they can't evolve stably, if they have the kind of disorder that we saw in 1989, but if it spreads even further, then you're going to have a lot of disruption to the world system. You're going to have a China that produces refugees, a China that produces economic destruction, a China that produces climate destruction, a China that's like a huge North Korea potentially, or a huge Somalia potentially. You know, I would rather have China as it is, but to put itself on a stable political footing. So that's my second reason why I think human rights does matter to us. I think we want the Chinese system to be better than it is, so that it'll work better. And now, I must say that when I, as a human rights activist, say those kinds of things, of course the Chinese security guys don't believe it. If I were a Chinese security guy, I wouldn't believe it either. You know, he's rationalizing his subversion of our system by saying that it's in our interest. I see that. But you guys are not security guys, so I can say that to you. No, you know, because I actually do think this is a reason why we have an interest, we're not citizens of China, but the way China goes is part of our world as well. The third point that I want to mention, and it's one that I actually don't believe, some people think that if the Chinese political system were to democratize, their foreign policy would be more cooperative with us. They would let Taiwan go independent. They wouldn't build up their military. They would dialogue with the Tibetans and do what we think they should do in Tibet. I actually don't think that's true, because my analysis of Chinese security interests holding this big country together, getting control back over Taiwan, providing China with the ability to defend itself around its borders and to control or influence disorder around its borders, that those fundamental security interests wouldn't change if there were a democratic regime. So my third point is one that I mention only to set aside. And the final point about why we care has to do with China's impact on the international system that we all, live in. One of the benefits of engagement of this policy that the U.S. has followed with China since Nixon has been to bring China into the international system. And we hear so much in our newspapers about China violating international trade or China violating, manipulating their currency and all that, that I think we lose sight of the fact that by and large, China has joined into all, as far as I know, I can't think of an exception, of the various international, what we call international regimes, the international normative systems that exist in the world. They joined the World Trade Organization. They've joined the various treaties for the protection of intellectual property rights. They've joined the treaties for arms control and disarmament. They've joined, whatever else there is, the international health system, the World Health Organization. They've joined the international human rights system. They participate in the UN Human Rights Council. They've signed as many human rights treaties as the United States has signed, and they've joined in. And although any country that joins in, there can be some dispute about whether it's obeying the rules. The US itself sometimes gets sued in the World Trade Organization dispute resolution mechanism for violating the WTO rules. We often are accused of illegal behavior when we, invade, for example, Iraq, without UN Security Council authorization, although we claimed that it was tacitly authorized by certain Security Council resolutions. So once you join these regimes, every country is vulnerable to some questioning around the edges. But I would say in general, China has joined. In general, China complies with its obligations approximately as well as any other country. But in the human rights part of that regime, the human rights regime is a series of treaties and a series of institutions that have been built up since World War II, and especially since the 1970s and on up, that are a kind of patchwork. It's not a very complete system, but a kind of patchwork of norms and institutions that are trying to set standards and enforce standards against the worst human rights violations, things like the indictment of al-Bashir of Sudan by the International Criminal Court, that there's a movement in this direction, that China has joined that regime in large part in order to begin to shape the regime the way that China and its like-minded countries, which are Iran and Libya and countries like that, would like it to be shaped. And this, I think, is very damaging to a project that has been of great importance to us. This comes back to the question of us, who are we? It's been of great importance to the United States. Really, the beginning of this international human rights regime was with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, the Four Freedoms, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and it's been a thing that the U.S., even though the U.S. has sometimes violated it, that the U.S. has wanted to build, because we believe that a world in which there's a robust system of human rights norms and institutions is basically a world where the values we believe in will be promoted at the international level, which is good for us in many ways. It should be good for American security and for our security as individuals. And the Chinese have joined this regime, and because China's becoming so powerful in the world and has so many allies and has so many smart diplomats, they've been able to lead a very broad coalition of countries that would like to weaken that regime, to interpret the norms in ways that are compatible with authoritarianism, to weaken the ways in which the UN institutions operate. And I think that we we need to care about that because it's not just China. This is a global system that is quite fragile and which we would like to see growing. And that the U.S. needs, this is a criticism of the American government, that the U.S. needs to pay attention and be much more active. You know, when in these UN institutions such as the UN Human Rights Council, the Chinese send a big delegation of people who are very well trained. The United Nations sends a small delegation of people who are more or less amateurs, and they just beat us. And there's no need for that. So I think that we do care. We need to be in that values game, promoting our values. And of course, the first thing is to, instantiate our own values, to behave consistently, which is a daily struggle, and to continue to point out that the violations taking place in China are wrong, and to play the diplomatic game with as much energy as they do. So that's my fourth topic as far as why China's human rights matters to us. And I am only 2 minutes over, which for me is good performance. And then we're into the discussion part. So you please raise your hands. Yes.
A couple of questions. 20 years or more ago, the New York Times reported that the Chinese Communist government had for the first time published its laws. Are the laws available to people now?
Yeah, they really didn't have any laws until 1979. There was a constitution of 1954 that was revised in 1982, but there was nothing you would call a law that had, I don't think, maybe there were a few. So starting in 1979, the National People's Congress put into place the first criminal law in China, the first criminal procedure law in China, and in the years that have followed, they have promulgated, thousands of laws, including the most basic ones on civil procedure, company law, many, many laws, and they're all public as, being laws. There are certainly also vast numbers of secrets in China. One of the public laws is the state secrets law, by the way, which defines a state secret in an extraordinarily broad manner. So there are many secrets, but by using the word law, you're talking about something which, by definition in China, is published, and you can get it online and in the library and so on.
Okay, and second, you mentioned that America should be instantiating its values.
Yeah.
Some of us are quite unhappy that the Bush administration tortured people and that the Obama administration is not doing much about it, is not prosecuting, is not properly investigating, and continues military tribunals, indefinite detentions, the threat of rendition, and on, domestic spying. To you as an activist looking at China, how much do America's failures in those areas matter when we think about how China matters?
Yeah, I think those things are very important. I think it really hurts our credibility, especially in this diplomatic arena that I was talking about. I think for me as an activist doing China work, those issues don't come up as much because we're dealing with cases and we're dealing with China things. But I think the Chinese have answered in the past American criticisms of China. We published the annual State Department Human Rights Report that criticizes China and do other things that criticize China. They've published papers after ours criticizing human rights in the United States, and those papers are quite excellent. They criticize us for racism, they criticize us for poverty, they criticize us for not having a health care system. Their health care system has a lot of trouble, but they're building up, and it's in construction. But the concept is the reality is bad in China, but the concept is good. And so we have tremendous vulnerabilities that hurt us in advocacy. Yes. Yeah.
Professor Andrew, I like your argument, which is the U.S. cares about China's human rights issue because this is a moral ground that the U.S. holds, and I respect that. Help me understand this. If that's a moral ground that the U.S. holds so dearly to what they believe, why would the U.S. allow itself $670 trillion in debt to China? So my question is, if that's the moral concern, why would the U.S. borrow $670 trillion from China in the past and still owes that money?
Instead of doing what?
Instead of, say, if I hate the guts of him because he is an immoral person, I will hold up to my principle. I will tighten my belt, not to use a dime from you, not to borrow money from you.
So I think would it be, now first of all, I don't hate his guts. All right? I say that right to the camera. All right, we're talking to the cameraman here. But, and I don't think it's a question of hating the guts of China or hating anybody's guts, and especially not hating the business people and the laborers in China. So that's part of the answer. But it seems, would I be right to think that now the source of this borrowing of how many $1 trillion did you say? I lose track. $1 trillion here and it. The source of this borrowing is trade, all right? In other words, the borrowing that you're talking about wasn't just borrowing, it came about through trade. So that if I wanted to not borrow that money, the way to not borrow it is to not trade with China. Am I correct? No, but the reason that they hold treasury bonds is that they've generated a trade surplus with us. Am I right? Okay, so I'm recasting your question to ask whether we should respond to the human rights violations by refusing to trade with China, which has been a proposal, because if we didn't trade with them, then there wouldn't be any borrowing taking place. I'll make that claim. I'm not an economist, but believe me when I say this, or don't, as the case may be. But okay, so this is a question about trade sanctions. It's a question about cutting off trade with China. And I've never been in favor of cutting off trade with China because I sort of gave the reasons before. I think trading with China has been a brilliant move. I think it has allowed China to improve its human rights. I think it has brought China a huge stake in the world trading system that the United States basically created. I think it's created tremendous benefit for us as well. We've got a lot of wonderful products at a very good price. Any change in the international system, whether it's Japan, whether it's India, is going to cause, the polite word is readjustment. Okay, so some sectors in the United States have been affected. We no longer produce certain things, but if China didn't exist, we still wouldn't be producing those things. They'd be produced in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, and so forth. So I don't see any good reason, and I don't think that canceling trade with China would benefit the Chinese human rights victims either. So basically that's my answer, is that I don't see that connection. Morally, I don't see it. My moral calculus is more complicated. If I could identify a particular villain, I might do what U.S. policy sometimes does do and deny that person a visa or something like that, but I wouldn't want to cut off trade totally. Up in the back? Yeah, yep.
I know you wouldn't like to cut off trade entirely, but what about stricter regulations on what we do buy from not just China, but everyone? Do you think that would be a better way to go about?
Which regulations do you mean?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, like,
with the aim of diminishing the trade deficit that we have?
No, I mean like diminishing like the human rights violations.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
yes. So, yeah. So I think so now we're into an area which is not really a China area, but it has to do with sweatshops, environmental damage around the world, and whether or not the free, what is it called, fair trade movement, things like that. So am I in favor of a movement, whether it's generated by consumers or by NGOs or by activists or even conceivably by international agreements through the WTO or the NAFTA or something that would require, in various ways, the things that we import to be produced with a fair wage without environmental damage? Yes, I'm in favor of those kinds of movements. I'm in favor of the fair trade movement. I'm in favor of business and human rights, which is a movement that's out there. I don't think that that would do anything to improve our trade deficit. It's not about protectionism. And it's not specifically about China. I mean, I think we have to worry when our business with China produces violations. So there's an organization called China Labor Bulletin, and another one called China Labor Watch, and another one as well called the National Labor Committee. There are several organizations out there that will produce exposés and say, for example, that your McDonald's Happy Meal toy was produced in a factory in China with child labor, for example. I think those exposés are very, very useful, and that the McDonald's company should go to its contractor. These are not produced by McDonald's, but by some factory that McDonald's signed a contract with. McDonald's should go to them and say, you're supposed to not have child labor, and McDonald's should have a contract with the contractor that says no child labor, no labor rights violations. Movement in that direction, I think, is very useful. In the very back?
Without representative democracy, some Chinese have turned to the right to petition. How influential are those documents?
The right to petition?
Yeah, how
Yeah.
influential are those documents?
You mean, so you're talking about these people with a grievance who go up to Beijing, or who go to at different levels to present their grievance. So that's a system called petitioning. Well, it's hard to know. I mean, this is my academic mind kicking in. I'm thinking, where's the proof? But I think what we really do know is that they're seldom effective. That you use the word documents, and that throws me off a little bit. I mean, the people can either come in person or they can send a document. But their appeal usually doesn't produce a good result, because the way the system usually works is that the individual gets to the petitioning office and they present their, it's hard to get in, and they finally get in. You present your petition and the guy writes a thing on it saying See, it goes back to this party secretary system. Let's say that your problem took place in your local, say, village, that the party secretary is behind everything that happens. You go up to the province to complain about it. They write a letter to the party secretary saying, Nathan has complained that you took his land, look into it. You go back to the same party secretary. Now he's mad at you because you went to the province. Things usually don't get any better. It's very rare that occasionally the media in China, which have always played this role, that they're looking for stories that exemplify the fairness of the whole system, the fact that the Communist Party stands for the people, that the Communist Party can correct mistakes that were made. The media will from time to time pick up a case of a corrupt party secretary or an atrocious violation, PLA. There's a recent one I heard about, a military hospital that was making money by sort of kidnapping patients that would be delivered to them for treatment. They would keep them, they would drug them, dose them, make a lot of money off, because the system is that the hospital gets paid for the drugs and doctors get paid for the drugs that they deliver there, which is a mistake type of system. and people were getting drugged literally to death and dying. And my organization, Human Rights in China, the petitioner called us and told this story. We published a press release, and the media in China picked it up because it's a great story. And it's the local PLA hospital that you can go against. It's not against Hu Jintao. It's not against the central leadership. And they published it. And so when it gets picked up like that, the perpetrators are very embarrassed and they're on the hot seat. And that works. But the general, to answer your question, the overall, level of effectiveness of that system is extremely low, as far as I know. Okay, yes.
As an international player, I'm curious your opinion in terms of the government. How important is human rights to them in China in possibly helping us in areas where they may have more of a relationship with, say, like Burma, or, I don't know, their opinion on an al-Bashir and Sudan situation?
Yeah.
Are human rights even important to the party, and would they maybe be willing to come to bat with some of the players?
Would the Chinese government help us or help the international community to press the Burmese or Sudanese regime? I think that the way they see it is that in countries like Burma and the Sudan and Iran and stuff like that, Pakistan, China has quite a few really pressing national interests. In Sudan especially, it's their investments in oil and the supply of oil that they get there, and big investments there. And in Burma, it's a host of things. Burma is a neighboring country. It has access to the Andaman Sea. It's a source of resources. It's a strategic location and stuff like that. So they are very, very concerned with their relationship with those regimes. Now, when they look at the Burma regime, I think they see a regime that they feel it's important that, or North Korea, it's important that they have a partnership with that regime because they have interests today. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. They have immediate interests, and these are the guys in charge. At the same time, they see the vulnerability of that regime, that it's a regime that's in trouble internationally and at home. And they would like that regime, they don't think of it as improving human rights, but they would like to see that regime looking down the road and adopting some kind of a strategy to stabilize itself, to manage its succession issues. But then the Chinese feel that they can't aggressively push any particular solution on the Burmese or on the North Koreans or on al-Bashir, because these guys are not very open to advice. And the Chinese really don't believe in coming at them the way we do with the sort of broad principles of human rights. First of all, they don't think those principles necessarily work. If al-Bashir just gives human rights to everybody, Sudan would fall apart and the Chinese investments would, be overrun and stuff like that. So that's a long answer to say no to your question. Yes.
I'm curious how your organization is able to effectively advocate for human rights when China is so opposed to outsiders meddling in their internal affairs. How are you able to?
Right. Well, that's a great question. I mean, it's very, very hard. And the Chinese government has classified human rights in China as a enemy, or a didui shili, a hostile force. So they absolutely stonewall human rights in China every which way that they can. And there are a lot of other organizations out there that are also doing similar work. There's a good one called CHRD, China Human Rights Defenders, and I mentioned some of the others, China Labor Bulletin. So the answer that I'm giving you would sort of be more or less true, but with some different wrinkles for each organization. But basically, I suppose you could say that the strategy that human rights in China has adopted has three big parts to it. One is we get information out about these violations because people in China contact us. CHRD does that. All of these organizations do so. We get the information out there so that the international media and so that it can be known and used. The second thing is we have a lot of information that we try to put into China, much of it written by Chinese who can't publish in China. We do it on the internet, we do it in a print publication, we do it in a kind of spam type newsletter that goes in, and we're trying to create an information cycle that breaks, that's free. And the third thing that Human Rights in China does is it works very hard in this international arena that I talked to. It briefs the so-called special mechanisms that are in the UN system. It lobbies at the Human Rights Council. It does what are called shadow reports for the UN treaty bodies. The whole domain of international human rights diplomacy is quite technical. It's created by lawyers and diplomats. And our executive director is a retired law professor, so she understands the system and the protocol, and so she's very active on the international scene. We brief governments that are engaged in bilateral human rights dialogues with China. We're trying to make the international human rights institutions work better. They are understaffed. They're kind of overwhelmed by Chinese staffing and sophistication. So I think we play an important role in equalizing the balance. So that's what we try to do. But then if you say, is all of that effective? It's a hard slog. What is effective? I mean, the system is quite, Chinese system is very stable. It's going on like it does. We don't see a major change, but we feel that each little battle that we fight, we're just a $4 million, we're a tiny organization, that each battle that we fight is, better to be fought than not to be fought. Yes, sir.
Hi. You said it matters because it is in the U.S. National security interest for China to be stable. But isn't it also true that our stability depends on them financing our laws and our government? And do you foresee a time when China might shut the tap off or even pull the plug as they limit their export markets?
Well, I do think we should pull our socks up, and stop running such a big trade and budget deficit totally. But as far as your question, I actually don't foresee them pulling the plug because they are also what is the word I want to use? Because they're holding so many of our dollars, they're very dependent upon us. They're also dependent upon us. We are the ultimate market for China.
They're the pusher.
What?
We're the addict and they're the pusher.
We're the addict, but in another way, they're the addict. They're kind of addicted to these US dollars because they need to export to keep their economy growing. And although they try to diversify their export markets, they have done so, and they're also trying to build up their domestic market, the US market remains very, very important. If they were to dump dollars, all these dollars that they hold would diminish in value. It's a hard job holding that many US dollars. In fact, where do you invest them? What can you do with them? And stuff. So I think they are kind of trapped. We are trapped together, and we got to move slowly out of the posture that we're in. Where's our wildlife biologist? What is it when two large animals are in a posture that they have to move out of very, very slowly? I'm afraid this is not suitable for grizzly territory, but you know what I'm saying? I'm getting a little carried away with my metaphors, but the point is I don't think they can just dump us. The world is too small for them to dump us. So that's another long-winded no answer. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the pothole problem. When this country hits a big pothole and the economic vehicle gets rattled, then some people say it's just the wrong vehicle, but have an entirely different economy.
Mm-hmm.
But usually the response has been, it's basically fine, it just needs to be fixed,
Mm-hmm.
and then with the two-party system we can go to the other party and say, you fix it, you're right. So the other party gets a chance to fix it. And so if we assume two things, one is that the Chinese are basically in agreement with that economic system and the prosperity that it produces, and that the Communist Party can sort of mimic a regime change by purging some people, say, yeah, that's terrible, and then bringing in others from within the party, and say, you take over.
Yeah.
Then the pothole problem would be that threatening.
Yeah, so that is very possible that China can, and and in a way 89 was an example of this. 1989, these student pro-democracy demonstrations all around the country, and a big crisis, and then the army comes in killing people, and the regime seemed to be in terrible trouble. But it did sort of a version of what you said. Some people were purged. Deng Xiaoping sort of said, we're going forward, and they re-engaged eventually in 1992 with their reform program, and it's been successful. So it is, one scenario certainly is that if they hit a pothole, they adjust. The scenario that I'm thinking about, which is more political, has to do with, you might say, legitimacy deflation, sort of like happened in East Germany. Now, East Germany was a very different, in many, many ways, different kind of situation. But we did see there how all the air can go out of a regime all of a sudden. It doesn't even believe in itself anymore. Nobody obeys it, and its members feel that they're on a sinking ship and they jump off. And it seems to me that if you think about what we've been through, where we thought we were in, say, 2008, we thought we were losing the war in Iraq. We thought we were losing the war in Afghanistan. We thought that our economy was entering a depression. Now, things have turned out maybe a little bit better than what we thought at that time. But I think if the Chinese people perceived that, say, China had gotten into a war in Taiwan and had lost that war, and the international trade was disrupted, and millions, tens of millions were being thrown out of work, and living standards were declining and stuff like that, I don't see them just turning around and accepting another leader from the Communist Party. I mean, that could happen. I think there's a great risk of some kind of collapse. Now, I don't see signs of a collapse. I'm not predicting a collapse, but I think a regime that's constructed in the way that I've been describing is a regime that has less adaptability, is more vulnerable to collapse because it relies so much on repression than our type of regime. So that's the risk that I'm looking at. So what you say could happen, but it could also go the other way, I think.
If we went back just a second to a previous question, if Deng Xiaoping had not taken power in China when he did, where do you think China would be today?
So who would have taken power? Because Mao was dead, so somebody had to take power. What? If Hua Guofeng had stayed in power, I don't know what he stood for. No, but I think you're right that Deng made a number of very bold strategic decisions and managed a number of very, very difficult transitions. So the strategic decisions that he made, the biggest one, I suppose, was to embrace the global economy, to plunge into the global economy with all the risks that involved of destabilization and loss of control, which hasn't happened. And to liberalize the system domestically, and he took that quite far. Because despite all of the repression that takes place, that repression is targeted on certain people causing trouble, and the majority of people don't experience repression, and many Chinese I've talked to don't seem to be aware that the repression exists, thanks to the efficacy of the propaganda system. And in doing so, he had to manage a lot of difficult international transitions. The entry into the WTO was a very protracted process that went on past the death of Deng and had to be, by which he started. And normalization of relations with the United States and normalization of relations with the then Soviet Union. He managed all of these things, and domestically he had to keep the party together. They were very, very divided. The new book of Zhao Ziyang was the party leader who was purged as a result of Tiananmen in 1989, and after he passed away, last year, his secret memoirs that he had taped over his grandson's, children's songs tapes were published, called, in the English version, called what? Prisoner of what? Prisoner of something. Zhao Ziyang tells in his memoirs these terrible power struggles that went on around Deng's policies, and Deng kept it all together. He had the authority and the guts to choose, and in some ways he was a difficult leader and made some mistakes, but he did manage to keep it all together. And then this final decision in 1992 that despite the Tiananmen crackdown, despite the Western sanctions, despite the risk of inflation, we're going to go ahead with the open door policy, turned out to produce tremendous benefits for China. So but who there would have been if he wasn't there, that's really a puzzle. Yes.
Looking at China's domestic policy, I think from afar, I tend to view it as kind of a juggernaut, like they decide what they're going to do, and by God, they do it,
Yeah.
good or bad. But it seems like on some small issues, sometimes they will actually respond and hope and go back. About a year or two ago, they were going to slap a internet nanny on all the computers sold in China, and there was, international disapproval, but domestic disapproval. They went back.
Yeah.
Other small things. Are there? Do you know sort of principles? Are there things that hold together that you can sort of predict when the Chinese government may say, "Hey, we're going to do this," and then they say, "Well, gee, maybe not."
I don't think you can predict, but my retrospective. Another example would be how they handled HIV/AIDS, denying everything, and then when they got a lot of pressure to open up and give true statistics and cooperate, they did the SARS epidemic as well, where they tried to cover it up. I think that a pattern that I see is that a decision is made by an agency below the highest level, the health ministry or the information ministry or something, and that the decision is somewhat blinkered. It was not made with full awareness of everything, and the leadership becomes aware of more information, and I don't see them yielding to pressure. I see them yielding to better information when they become aware that a mistake was made, and it was made by somebody below the highest level. They can correct that mistake. I think if they make a mistake, the Politburo Standing Committee, the top leader, then they're not going to admit that mistake. China does change course, but not by admitting mistakes, always by claiming continuity of policy. And I think the security agencies are pretty much exempt from this corrective mechanism because I think they're extremely powerful, and they have a kind of trump card when they tell the leadership, we've evaluated all the information. We think this guy is a risk. We can handle it. Who's going to overturn that? So I don't see any that I can think of right now, cases where, we have done a lot of work. All the human rights people have done a great deal of work making public how the Chinese law itself is violated in these cases and so forth, and you never see any, I hate to say never, but correction of those cases. In the past, it was a little different. In the 90s, when they were under a lot of pressure from the US for human rights and we were threatening these trade sanctions, they used to release this or that or the other person on a certain occasion when it was necessary. Yes?
Yes, in a recent issue of the New York Review of Books, Tony Jute had an article, actually the first chapter of a book that he's written, about the relationship between income inequality and many social economic parameters. And of course, the U.S. is way off, is fallen off the cliff in that respect. China was not included in where this question of income inequality between the top and the mass of the people is. Do you have any notions on that score?
As I understand it from The Economist, income inequality is severe in China. I'm not sure how it compares to the U.S. I think it's worse, actually. Now, it's not just, yeah, is that right? Now, but it may be that the U.S. is worse in another sense, which is the amount by which the richest among us are richer. The few, top 100 people may be much more richer than the rich people in China. But the type of statistics like the Gini index that, sum up the entire inequality picture in one number, China is worse. And that's because I think there's been a rapid rise of a rather large, upper middle class and entrepreneur class together with the vast population of people who are poor. I said before that a lot of people were raised out of poverty, but they're still very, very poor. So the peasant class, which is a huge class, is still, for the large part, very poor, while the urban entrepreneur class is, limitlessly rich. So it's worse, in short. Yeah, and Steve, my host, Steve Levine, says yes, so he's my data checker. He's my personal Google. Yes. Okay, hi.
Wondering what I think about the proposal that some social scientists and also business executives, others in China are making to follow the model of the special economic zones where China, you may recall in the early 80s, set aside certain areas such as Shenzhen where they would allow much more type of marketization of the enterprises, and they've been done before, so that if it wasn't working, they could pull back. And it's been recommended that maybe this be tried in the area, say, of internet censorship, and others such as in terms of reforming the justice system so it's not dominated by the party, that you'd actually try this at the lowest level courts. One reason why so many of these rural folk are going to Beijing to do this petitioning, because they see no justice in their local courts because they're controlled by the party, official party secretary. So if there's a suggestion that this could be tried in kind of a non-threatening basis, because the leaders are very risk averse in the party, then if they found out that in fact all hell didn't break loose, just as it didn't break loose in Shenzhen, it was quite a success, then they might be courageous enough to try to see that applied on a wider scope, maybe higher up in the government. But you can't try to reform it at the top levels.
Yeah, so there's the whole reform process that Deng Xiaoping carried out. There was a great deal of this pattern of local experimentation, and people continue to propose local experiments. I'm aware of the one about independent courts to be tried. I think it has been tried or is being tried in Shenzhen. Am I right? Maybe I'm not sure about it. Yeah, but I've never heard the proposal for an experimental zone of internet freedom, and I just wonder how that would be possible to the internet by nature is not zoned geographically, so how would you do that? I don't know. See, I'm not very technical. But I haven't heard that proposal, so I think you should make the proposal and see where it goes. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.